Here's a compelling start to your YouTube video story. The snow fell in thick, silent waves outside the window, blanketing the small suburban street in a hushed, white stillness. It was Christmas Eve, a time when most homes glowed with warm lights and laughter. But at the far end of the cul-de-sac, one house stood dark and quiet, its windows drawn shut, as if the world outside didn't exist. Inside, an elderly man sat alone in his worn recliner, his frail hands resting on the arms of the chair, his eyes fixed on a faded photograph on the mantel. His wife, gone for 3 years now, smiled back at him in that picture, her joy frozen in time, a sharp contrast to the emptiness that now filled his days. Across the street, Emma Martinez watched the house through the frosty window of her own living room. She wasn't the type to spy on neighbors, but something about Mr. Caldwell had always tugged at her heart. Ever since his wife passed, the once vibrant man had withdrawn completely. She had never seen any family visit, and rumors swirled that he had no one left. Tonight of all nights, the sight of his darkened house felt unbearably heavy. Emma wasn't your average young woman in her late 20s. A fit, unassuming brunette with sharp eyes and a quiet demeanor, she blended seamlessly into the world around her. She worked as a freelance writer, or at least that's what she told most people. In reality, she carried a secret that few could ever guess. Emma was a Navy SEAL, one of the rare women to pass the grueling training and earn her place on a team. Her life had been a whirlwind of covert missions and unimaginable challenges, yet her quiet neighborhood was where she came to recharge and reconnect with the simple joys of life. Tonight, though, something felt different. As she stared at Mr. Caldwell's darkened house, she couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to do something. The ache of loneliness she saw in him reminded her too much of her own father after her mother passed. She remembered how small gestures, a kind neighbor dropping off a casserole, a thoughtful card in the mail, had made a world of difference. Maybe, she thought, she could do the same for Mr. Caldwell. She glanced at the clock. It was nearing 7 p.m. If she hurried, she could still pull something together. Emma grabbed a basket from her pantry and began filling it with whatever she could find. Cookies she had baked earlier, a few holiday treats, and even a small wrapped gift she had planned to send to her sister but could easily replace later. She topped it off with a soft, warm scarf she had knitted herself. It wasn't much, but it was something. As she trudged across the snowy street, basket in hand, she rehearsed what she might say. She didn't want to come off as intrusive or pitying. Maybe she'd just keep it simple, wish him a Merry Christmas, and leave the basket at his door if he didn't answer. The porch light flickered on as she approached, and her stomach fluttered with nerves. She knocked gently, then stepped back, waiting. For a long moment, there was nothing. No sound, no movement. She was about to turn away when the door creaked open. Mr. Caldwell stood there, his face lined with age and sorrow. He looked at her with cautious eyes, as if unsure whether she was real or just another ghost of his past. Emma offered a tentative smile, holding out the basket. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Caldwell," she said softly. "I just thought, well, I thought you might like some company tonight." For a moment, he didn't say anything. His gaze dropped to the basket, then back to her face. His lips parted as if to speak, but instead, his eyes welled up, and he stepped aside, motioning for her to come in. The warmth of his small, cozy living room was a sharp contrast to the icy chill outside. They sat together for an hour, maybe more, sharing stories and laughter. She learned that he had been a schoolteacher for most of his life, that he had traveled to Europe with his wife in their younger days, and that Christmas had always been her favorite holiday. By the time Emma left, the dark cloud that had hung over Mr. Caldwell seemed to have lifted just a little. He stood at the door, waving as she walked back to her house, feeling a sense of fulfillment she hadn't experienced in a long time. But the story didn't end there. A chill ran down Emma's spine. This wasn't just about an inheritance or a kind gesture anymore. There was a real threat in play. She straightened in her chair, her training kicking in. If someone's trying to intimidate you, we need to take precautions. Do you feel safe here? Mr. Caldwell offered a weak smile. I've lived my life trying not to let fear rule me. I won't start now, but I'm glad I have you, Emma. I feel protected. That night, Emma stayed on high alert, keeping an eye on Mr. Caldwell's house from her own. The snow had stopped, leaving the street eerily silent under the dim glow of streetlights. As she watched, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, and it did. Around midnight, a shadow moved near Mr. Caldwell's side yard. Emma's heart leaped. Grabbing her coat, she stepped outside, her breath visible in the freezing air. She crossed the street silently, her senses heightened. The shadow was gone, but fresh footprints in the snow led toward the back of the house. Emma followed them, her steps careful and deliberate. As she rounded the corner, she caught a figure crouched near one of the windows. "Hey," she called out, her voice firm. The figure bolted, but Emma was faster. She tackled them to the ground, pinning them with ease. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" she demanded. The man squirmed under her grip, but she held him steady until she saw his face. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, with a grizzled look that matched the desperation in his eyes. "I didn't mean any harm," he sputtered. "I just wanted to talk to him." Emma eased her grip but kept her guard up. "Talk to him about what?" "He owes me," the man cried. "He built his fortune on my ideas, and when things fell apart, he left me with nothing. Now he's giving it all away, and I'm supposed to just accept that." Emma's stomach churned. This wasn't just a petty grudge. It was a deeply rooted wound. She stood, pulling the man to his feet. "Breaking into his house isn't the way to fix this. If you have a claim, take it to the lawyers." The man stared at her, his shoulders slumping. "I just wanted him to hear me out, to make things right." Emma sighed, her own emotions swirling. She saw the pain in his eyes, the anger mixed with sorrow. "Go home," she said firmly. "I'll talk to him, but if I catch you here again, I won't be so forgiving." The man nodded reluctantly and trudged off into the night. Emma stayed outside for a while, making sure he didn't return before heading back to her own home. The next morning, she told Mr. Caldwell what had happened. His face fell as she described the encounter. "Henry," he murmured, shaking his head. "I should have known he'd come." "Why didn't you tell me about him sooner?" Emma asked. Mr. Caldwell looked at her, his eyes heavy with guilt. "I thought I could handle it on my own. But you're right, it's time to face this." Together, they arranged a meeting with Henry, mediated by the lawyers. The confrontation was tense but cathartic. Mr. Caldwell acknowledged his role in their falling out, offering Henry a settlement that would ease his financial struggles. It wasn't an easy conversation, but by the end, there was a sense of closure for both men. A week later, as Emma sat with Mr. Caldwell in his living room, he handed her a small, wrapped gift. "I want you to have this," he said. "It's a reminder that kindness changes lives. You changed mine." Emma unwrapped the gift to find a simple, yet beautifully crafted compass. "A compass?" she asked, smiling. "To guide you," he said softly, "wherever life takes you." When Mr. Caldwell passed a few months later, Emma felt the loss deeply, but she also felt honored to have been a part of his final chapter. She carried his lessons with her, using his story to inspire others in her life and career. Sometimes, the smallest gestures lead to the most extraordinary connections, and in a world that often feels cold and distant, those connections are what truly guide us home. The next morning, as the sun rose over the snowy street, Emma was startled by an unexpected knock at her door. She opened it to find two sharply dressed men standing on her porch, their faces unreadable. "Miss Martinez?" one of them asked. "Yes," she replied, her heart suddenly racing. "I'm Robert Blackwell, and this is my colleague, James Fulton. We're attorneys representing Mr. Caldwell. May we come in? There's something we need to discuss with you." Emma froze, her mind racing with possibilities. Why would Mr. Caldwell need lawyers to talk to her? Had she done something wrong? Had her kind gesture somehow backfired? She stepped aside, letting them in, her Navy SEAL instincts kicking in as she prepared for whatever was about to unfold. Little did she know, this Christmas would bring a twist she never could have seen coming, a revelation that would challenge everything she thought she knew about kindness, legacy, and the hidden lives of those around her. "Would you like me to continue?" Emma's pulse quickened as she closed the door behind the lawyers. Her training taught her to stay calm under pressure, but this was unlike anything she had faced before. What could they possibly want with her? She gestured toward the couch, inviting the men to sit. Robert Blackwell, the older of the two, placed a sleek leather briefcase on the coffee table. His demeanor was polite but serious, while his younger colleague, James, seemed a bit nervous. "Ms. Martinez," Robert began, his tone measured, "we understand you visited Mr. Caldwell yesterday evening." Emma nodded, her brow furrowed. "Yes, I took him some Christmas treats and spent a little time with him. Is everything all right?" Robert exchanged a glance with James, then leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Caldwell was deeply moved by your kindness. In fact, he told us it was the first time in years he felt any real joy during the holidays. What you did for him meant more than you could possibly know." Emma felt a mix of relief and confusion. "That's good to hear. But why are you here? This seems serious." Robert's expression softened, but his voice remained steady. "Before we answer that, we need to provide some context. You see, Mr. Caldwell isn't exactly who he appears to be. To most of the neighborhood, he's just a retired schoolteacher. But in reality, he's a man of substantial means. Wealth he's kept well hidden for personal reasons. After his wife passed, he withdrew from the world, feeling there was no one left he could trust." Emma blinked, caught off guard. She thought of the modest house and Mr. Caldwell's simple lifestyle. It was hard to imagine him as a wealthy man. "I had no idea," she murmured. "He always seemed so ordinary." "That's by design," Robert said. "He valued privacy above all else. But your act of kindness last night changed something in him. It reminded him of the goodness in people, of the connection he thought he'd lost forever." Emma shifted uncomfortably. While she was glad her gesture had made a difference, she couldn't shake the feeling that this conversation was leading somewhere unexpected. "I'm still not sure what this has to do with me." James, the younger lawyer, cleared his throat and spoke for the first time. "Mr. Caldwell has made a decision. He wants to entrust you with something important, something that requires great responsibility." Emma's eyes narrowed. "What kind of responsibility?" Robert opened the briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documents. "Mr. Caldwell has decided to name you as the executor of his estate. He's also included you as a primary beneficiary." For a moment, Emma thought she hadn't heard correctly. "I'm sorry, what?" she said, her voice rising slightly. "I met him once. Why would he do something like that?" Robert held up a hand to calm her. "We understand your surprise. This isn't a decision he made lightly. Mr. Caldwell believes your actions demonstrate the kind of character he values, someone who acts selflessly, without expecting anything in return." Emma stood abruptly, pacing the room. This was too much, too fast. "But I'm not a lawyer or a financial expert. I'm just a neighbor who wanted to spread some holiday cheer. I'm not qualified for something like this." "You're more qualified than you think," Robert said gently. "And Mr. Caldwell believes in you. But there's something else you should know, something that adds urgency to this situation." Emma stopped pacing and turned to face them, her heart sinking. "What is it?" James hesitated, then spoke. "Mr. Caldwell's health is failing. He didn't want to burden you with the details, but he may not have much time left." The room fell silent as the weight of the revelation settled over Emma. She thought of the man she'd spent an evening with, his eyes lighting up as he shared stories of his late wife. The thought of him facing his final days alone was almost unbearable. "Why me?" she asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Surely there's someone else, an old friend, a distant relative." "There isn't," Robert said firmly. You're the first person in years to show him genuine kindness. That means more to him than you can imagine. Emma sank onto the couch, her mind racing. She felt a tug of guilt for doubting Mr. Caldwell's intentions, but also a wave of apprehension about what this responsibility would entail. What if she wasn't up to the task? What if she let him down? "Can I talk to him?" she asked finally. "I need to hear this from him directly." Robert nodded. "Of course. We can arrange for you to meet him later today." As the lawyers gathered their things and left, Emma sat in stunned silence. She looked out the window at Mr. Caldwell's house, now glowing with the soft light of morning. How had a simple act of kindness turned into something so life-altering? Later that afternoon, Emma found herself back at Mr. Caldwell's home. He greeted her with a warmth that seemed to melt away her doubts. Over tea, he explained his reasons for choosing her, his words filled with sincerity and gratitude. He spoke of his wife's belief in paying kindness forward, of his desire to leave a legacy that reflected the values they had shared. But as he spoke, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something unspoken lingering beneath his words. The lawyer's earlier mention of urgency gnawed at her, and she wondered if there was a piece of the puzzle she had yet to uncover. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room, Emma realized she was standing at a crossroads. Accepting Mr. Caldwell's trust would change her life in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. But walking away felt equally impossible. Unbeknownst to her, forces beyond her control were already in motion. Secrets from Mr. Caldwell's past were about to surface, setting off a chain of events that would test Emma's courage, her resolve, and her very identity as both a protector and a human being. And somewhere in the distance, hidden in the quiet hum of the evening, the first ripples of conflict began to stir. As Emma sat across from Mr. Caldwell, the weight of his request settled on her like the snow blanketing the world outside. The man before her wasn't just her grieving neighbor anymore. He was someone who had entrusted her with his legacy, his life's work, and his final wishes. His frailty was more apparent now, his trembling hands clutching a teacup as he spoke softly about the choices he'd made. "I've made mistakes, Emma," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "And I've kept things from the people around me. My wife, she always wanted me to let people in, but I was too stubborn, too scared. Now, with the time I have left, I want to set things right." Emma leaned forward, her instincts picking up on the tension in his words. "What kind of mistakes?" she asked gently. Mr. Caldwell hesitated, his gaze dropping to the tea swirling in his cup. "There's a man," he said finally, "a former business partner. We parted ways on bad terms years ago, and I've reason to believe he's been watching me. He might even try to challenge my decisions when I'm gone." Emma's seal instincts flared to life, sharpening her focus. "What do you mean by watching you? Has he threatened you?" Mr. Caldwell shook his head. "Not directly, but I've seen him near the house a few times. And the lawyers, they've received inquiries about my assets."